Howdy and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to delve a little deeper into a transaction and a specific concept of the Bitcoin protocol, identity. That is, how does the Bitcoin protocol identify participants in a transaction without the need of a third-party intermediary? The current transaction and every other transaction, including the previous transaction, is divided into two parts called the input and the output. Input and output are simply useful labels to refer to particular groups of numbers within a transaction. At this point, Alice needs to reference enough Bitcoin in a previous transaction to fulfill the current transaction, as well as a way to identify the recipient of the transfer of control of Bitcoin, in this case Bob. Alice identifies the recipient of this transfer of control by adding Bob's public key hash to the transaction. The public key hash is a form of Bob's public key, which is just a really long number that results from some interesting mathematical equations that I'll have fun exploring with you. For now, I'm going to concentrate on examining Bob's public key and return shortly to his public key hash. The public key and the public key hash becomes Bob's quasi-identity. I use the modifier quasi because although Bob's public key will become an integral part in identifying the recipient of Alice's transfer of control of Bitcoin, the public key isn't directly connected to the identity of the person named Bob. The only way for Bob to be linked directly with this number is for him to disclose the link purposefully or inadvertently to someone, or for a trusted third party, such as a Bitcoin exchange, to disclose the link. For example, most Bitcoin exchanges store the true identity of their clients, and this stored identity could be associated with some Bitcoin or Bitcoin transaction stored within an account. So how is this public key created? The answer to that question requires a bit of time and some very interesting mathematical equations. For now, I'm going to create black boxes as placeholders for various Bitcoin protocol features that I'll return to unpack later in much greater detail. The first of these black boxes is the public key creator, and it uses elliptic curve cryptography to produce Bob's public key. And don't worry, I'll be exploring elliptic curve cryptography in nauseating detail. Wait, let me rephrase that. I will be exploring elliptic curve cryptography in fascinating detail. The functional requirements of the public key creator are to create a number that is computationally infeasible to create without a secret private key as input. Now, I'm going to be using the phrase computationally infeasible a lot. In fact, I've done a separate video covering it, but since this is my first use of the phrase, I'll explain what I mean. Computationally infeasible means that although not impossible, the resources and time necessary to accomplish a given task, like computing a private key from a public key, are massive and lengthy, as in exceeding the resources of the planet and taking billions of years to complete. However, computing power continues to increase, and therefore what seems impossible today may not be in the future. So while not technically impossible, today, using the parameters of the Bitcoin protocol, it's computationally infeasible that anyone can compute a private key from a public key. So Bob creates a secret private key and passes it to the public key creator, and through the use of elliptic curve cryptography, produces his public key. And anyone that has access to that private key can generate Bob's public key at will. Therefore, it's vital that Bob's private key be kept confidential and protected. In the early years of the Bitcoin protocol, public keys were used to identify the recipients of a transfer of control of Bitcoin within a transaction. The security of the public key relied solely upon the difficulty of solving a particular scheme of mathematical equations around elliptic curve cryptography. Later, the Bitcoin protocol was extended to incorporate hash public keys to enhance security. So, what's a hash public key? I'll add another black box and label it the hash creator. As a review from the Bitcoin Protocol Fundamentals video, a hash's functional requirements are to use a mathematical scheme that takes arbitrary length data and produces a fixed length result. Like the public key creator, a hash should be simple to create so long as the original input is known. However, it should be computationally infeasible to discover the original input from the hashed result. Further, it should be computationally infeasible, given two different inputs, for the hash to produce the same result. However, given the same input, the hash will produce an identical result no matter how many times the hash is calculated. If instead even the smallest part of the input is changed, the resulting hash output, also called a digest, will be completely different. For example, if a given public key and resulting public key hash are generated, and I'm only given the public key hash, I can validate whether any subsequent public key presented was the input for the original public key hash. I can simply hash the presented public key, and if the resulting public key hash is different from the original public key hash, I know that the public key presented isn't the same as the original public key. This will soon come in very handy when I address validation of the transaction. In fact, this holds true for any input to a hash algorithm. That is, the hash algorithm can test whether an input is changed for a given hash result by simply hashing the input and comparing the previous result. Hashes are used throughout the Bitcoin protocol and provide an important component in independent verification that data hasn't changed. The Bitcoin protocol uses two different hashing algorithms on a public key known as SHA-256 and RIPE-MD-160. I've created a black box for each hash implementation for later examination. The public key first goes through the SHA-256 hash creator and then the RIPE-MD-160 hash creator to produce a resulting hash public key. By adding the hash algorithms, the public key is now protected by three different cryptographic algorithms: elliptic curve cryptography, SHA-256 hashing, and RIPE-MD-160 hashing. Therefore, in an attack, the public key would only be exposed if all three schemes were breached. Although the Bitcoin protocol supports both hashed and unhashed public keys, hashed public keys are now the dominant form used in transactions. To review, Bob can create a public key using his private key in the public key creator, and then create a hash public key using the SHA-256 hash creator and the RIPE-MD-160 hash creator with his public key as an input. So Alice now has a way of identifying the recipient of the transfer of control of Bitcoin to Bob in a transaction. Although not stored in the live blockchain, I want to touch on the main way of identifying a Bitcoin participant, and that's through a Bitcoin address. So what is a Bitcoin address and how is it different than a public key hash? Unfortunately, the terms Bitcoin address, public key hash, and address are often used interchangeably, despite the fact that they're not the same thing. In day-to-day use, Bob's public key hash isn't typically seen by users of Bitcoin. When Alice creates a transaction, her Bitcoin wallet will prompt her for Bob's Bitcoin address and not his hash public key. Even though Bitcoin addresses, again just a series of numbers, are not part of a transaction and therefore not part of the live blockchain, they're used because they're a bit smaller and reduce the chances of making a mistake when entering or copying them. Bottom line, Bob's hash public key can be derived from his Bitcoin address. Deriving the hash public key is done behind the scenes by the wallet software. For now, I'm going to add yet another black box for the functionality of creating the Bitcoin address from the hash public key and deriving the hash public key from the Bitcoin address. In review, the Bitcoin address is not stored as part of a transaction, but used instead as a shorthand for a participant's hash public key. The hash public key enhances the security of the public key using two different hash algorithms. The public key is created with the Bitcoin participant's private key using elliptic curve cryptography. And finally, the word address could be used synonymously with Bitcoin address. However, I find that confusing and therefore always say Bitcoin address instead of just address. At this point, I hope you understand generally how participants in a Bitcoin transaction are identified using public keys and public key hashes, as well as how those keys are distinguished from Bitcoin addresses and how Bitcoin addresses are used. In the next video, I'll explore another key goal of the transaction, documenting Alice's intent and right to transfer control of Bitcoin to Bob. If you found this video helpful, please click the like button as well as the subscribe button. And thanks for watching.